the supply chain. For the big picture, and particularly from the software supply chain, Simon, could you take us through what is it? How's it managed? What's going on currently in the solution? I know you can tell us this at length about what's going on now.
Try and keep it short.
What's the state of the nation? Yeah. So I'll give you 5 minutes, Simon.
Oh no, that's not. Oh gosh, where do we start? Okay. Well, let's start at the very top of the tree with government. So government needs society. Societies don't necessarily need governments, but governments do need a society to govern. In order to govern, they need legitimacy. Now, legitimacy contains many different elements. One is trust, and one is a claim of sovereignty. And we have different forms of sovereignty. We have territorial, we have economic, we have political, we have cultural, we have digital sovereignty. Now, all of those operate over theatres. So, territorial sovereignty operates over land, sea, air, and space. Digital operates over digital supply chains, and economic sovereignty operates over digital and physical supply chains. Now, it's not just enough to have a theatre, you've got to have capability to operate in that space, and you've got to have awareness. Now, we're very good at territorial awareness. We have lots of radars, we have lots of maps, we're good at that stuff. But we're pretty poor when it comes to understanding both the digital supply chain and the physical supply chain. And this has a number of consequences. One is in competition. If you are competing against somebody who has much higher levels of situational awareness, and we learned this in the military, and it also happens in economic sovereignty, then you're going to be at a serious disadvantage. So, for example, I used to work with Matt, at a company called Canonical. I ran strategy for them. We were about 2 to 3% of the operating system market against Red Hat and Microsoft. This was in 2008. We had maps. I don't believe they did. And so it took us 18 months, cost $500,000. I took 70% of all cloud computing. You see this with Amazon. Amazon's got a wonderful book out, Reaching Cloud Velocity, has about 17 pages of mapping in there, and they use it to take out industry after industry. A classic example is China government. I mean, very, very high levels of situational awareness across both the physical supply chain, so the theatre of physical supply chain, and also digital supply chain. So your first problem is competition. Your second problem is impact. If you don't understand those chains, then it's difficult to know what the impact of a change is going to be. In most organizations, the best we have are bill of materials, vendor lists, and client lists. So one up, one down. We don't actually understand the graph, let alone the map in which we are operating in, which is why we get these wonderful problems. China cuts back urea. That impacts things like AdBlue. We don't realize that AdBlue is a necessary component of diesel trucks in the engine control units, and that hits our supply chain. So you've got the first, which is competition. The second is impact. And the third is in terms of anticipation. So one of the things we were able to do in 2008 is with the map, there are about 170 common economic patterns, which most people are fairly oblivious to. And it was easy for us to see how everything was shifting to more utility computing, and there'll be a new set of practices we didn't know it was going to be called DevOps, but that would appear. And you're seeing the same thing starting in 2014 with the shift of the runtime to more of a utility with things like serverless. So I'm afraid all the stuff underneath it is now heading towards the new legacy. So that's all your Kubernetes, your containers, and all that sort of stuff. I mean, you tell people they're building the new legacy. It's like telling people building building data centers in 2009, 2010, that they were building the new legacy. Of course, people won't want to listen to it. But if you don't see those patterns, if you don't have that map, then you're going to have problems with where to invest as well. So basically, it's critical across physical and digital. At best, we have bill of materials, one up, one down. There are a few examples of organizations, governments who actually understand their supply chain. And then you've got sort of the in-between houses like the Hungarian government who've mapped out through VAT level records, or they haven't mapped it, they've graphed their supply chains. And so they now understand there's about 100 companies which are critical to 75% of its GDP. Of course, that was a bit of a shock for them, particularly when they found that 32 companies, anyone have a problem, you lose 25% of your GDP. That's where we are in the UK. We don't understand the space. Was that probably more than 5 minutes? Damn it, I'm sorry.
That was a really good help to actually understand where we're coming from and what our context is, and actually what our challenge is when we're starting to hit those our SBOMs. Those words, that phrase that's been thrown around, our software bill of materials. Matt, what are you finding is practically a problem?
Yeah.
This, rather than just this general statement of the way the world is, what does that actually mean?
First of all, it's nice to be sat next to two former colleagues. As Simon was innovating, I was learning from him on cloud, and Amanda was doing the same on legal. I was keeping them fueled with cups of tea. So I've obviously learned off both of them, and actually coming to the point that you were talking, Simon, about situational awareness, I feel like that's the point that we're at right now with our customers, because we've been through 7 or 8 years now of helping them to deploy Kubernetes. I'm in a very privileged position in some ways, because one of our projects, which just went to incubation with the CNCF cert manager, is at the heart of what we'd call the DevSecOps part of that ecosystem. And we're now coming to speak to these organizations about the open source software that they've got, how they secure it, what they do with it. And I would say for 10 years of adoption of open source software, it's been relatively plain sailing, but particularly on the supply chain side, that a lot of these people don't quite understand the situation they're in, and the fact that there is a storm coming in some ways. And we've seen parts of that through some of the issues that we've heard in the open source with Log4j and Heartbleed from some speakers earlier. But I think they're just starting to get their heads around the situation they're in, because I was that person when the government was locked up with those huge contracts that Lord Moore was talking about, trying to get open source adopted in government. And I was hitting my head against a brick wall. It was impossible. Over the past 10 years, that broke down, and we just saw massive adoption of that. But we've really optimized for speed and productivity of that open source software, rather than potentially thinking about the situation that we're putting ourselves in with the security of it. So I'm sitting here now speaking to people who've adopted this technology, and they're just trying to work out what they've got. And I'd say there's 3 areas that they're really struggling with. The first one is, what software have we got in our organization? What are our dependencies? And in a lot of cases, they don't know. As we start to do a bit of digging into this software, we realize a lot of it actually has issues with the licenses. We see some pretty serious issues with issues that have been created through possible compatibility issues is one. We see out-of-date software quite a lot. We see possibly very code that's potentially exploitable. I mean, there's quite a lot of issues, and all of a sudden people are now saying, "Oh my gosh, this is what have we got here? Like, what do we do?" And then they start to look into the ecosystem and say, "What tools can I use to try and actually help with that?" But we're only at the beginning of starting to learn about actually how to tackle this. So we've got a plethora of tools. It's very complex to get your head around. There are lots of fantastic frameworks that are coming out, but where do you actually start with that? How do you do it? It's very similar to early days of Kubernetes. People knew that they wanted to do it, but they didn't know how to go about doing it. And then the final thing is the people and processes around that, because we've still got the silos of the traditional InfoSec teams. We've got a move towards platform engineering, and no one's working out how to actually organize themselves around actually trying to secure the supply chains in the context of all that software that they've already got. So I'd say, chaos is one way of saying it. If you're being more polite, maybe somewhat confusion, and just starting to understand where they're going to try, what they're going to try and do with that, and where they're going to go with it now. That's where we're at.
Do you mind if I just add a point?
Please do.
So this is not just an IT problem, by the way. This is in finance, in construction, in agriculture, in retail. It's across pretty much every industry that I actually look into. So it's this lack of understanding of the supply chain, and the best examples are usually graphing. Very few are mapping, but mostly it's just one up, one down, and it's commonplace. Yeah. And they're all suffering these sorts of problems. So it's not a specific software. It's a much wider issue that most of our executive functions do not have good situational awareness. Mm-hmm. And what they've done is they've tended to rely on the market to solve the problem for them. So if something goes bang, we'll just get it from the market. Well, that's great until it isn't.
Yep.
As we've seen in the last 2 years over trying to get the way that the just-in-time that we've all grown to know and love.
In time.
Exactly, and the various logistical challenges first with the pandemic and then with the Ukraine situation and all the sanctions against Russia, suddenly you can't get what you thought you could get and it's all out because it's 3 steps down or 5 steps down your supply chain.
I don't mean to be harsh on government, by the way, because I co-wrote the Better for Less paper, which led to help create things like spend control. This is with Liam Maxwell and others. And the level of waste, duplication, and poor understanding is actually higher in the private sector than I ever find in government. So just to be clear, I don't mean to be harsh on government. But another example was Brexit. Because when I asked the Department of Business what are our 100 critical value chains, this is back in 2016, because you're going to need that for negotiation. To be honest, that data wasn't. No one seemed to know what that answer was.
Yes, I won't comment, but I think we've all, many of us will have experienced this. So, Phil, what is the digital catapult doing to help us to try and address some of these areas?
Yeah, I mean, not all of them, just to be clear. So these are a myriad of challenges that are distributed across a whole range of different actors. We've touched upon what the public sector can do in this. We touch upon what the private sector can do. But that also, they're very big nebulous terms, right? Within that, there are obviously a whole bunch of actors, all operating in silos. So one of the things that we're trying to do at the Digital Catapult, we're similar to Richard, who was on the panel previously. Digital Catapult is specifically looking at how we enable better and more healthy and sustainable and resilient technology ecosystems. So when we're looking at how you apply digital supply chains to physical supply chains, we need to think about all of the different components that Simon's just mentioned. These are real challenges that exist across all supply chains. So not only are we trying to address the physical siloed nature of a physical supply chain, we're also trying to navigate the challenges of a digital supply chain and how that comes together. And that means about establishing healthy technology ecosystems. That means better incentives, better governance, but also a healthy mix of both proprietary and open source technology software. And then you add into the mix of all of that a very large dominance of big tech players, a very singular technology innovation strategy, typically for R&D and innovation from most governments across the world, so it's not just a UK problem. And you start to see that all of this is a very, very messy jigsaw puzzle. So Digital Catapult, what we're trying to do is start to think about how do we build value chains and supply chains in the digital space, working with not just open source technology providers, startups and scale-ups, platform providers, digital infrastructure providers. How do we bring them together and have a shared goal between them? And shared incentives, but also shared carrots, but also shared sticks. So sometimes that might be from the bottom up, and sometimes that might be from the top down, depending on how the governance works. But what we're trying to do is establish where there are common interests and common value. And to do that, for supply chains, for example, let's say one of the main things you want to do in your supply chain management is drive towards net zero. That's one of the big, obviously, goals of a lot of different countries, companies and sectors. So in order to do that, they need to have a whole host of different actors coming together. They need the digital supply chain. You need the actual transport systems, logistics between different nodes of a supply chain. You might also want to have the data flow from from the individual businesses within that supply chain. And it's only by collecting all of that together that you can actually try and tackle the problem. And that's about governance, it's about leadership, I think was mentioned earlier as well. We need to instill that leadership and the drive and make sure that we have an overarching set of goals that all of those parties are working towards. And that, for me, is where SBOMs can come in a little bit. That's where some of the aspects of how we create more transparency and provenance between the different parts of the digital supply chain. SBOMs can obviously allow a little bit of a visibility of that. And then it's about how we build the interoperability between all those bits. And that's the difficult bit. That's an engineering challenge as much as it is a cultural and social challenge. But yeah, those are the things that we need to try and look at collectively together. And I think open source community has such a big role to play in that.
Can I, so that's first of all fascinating, totally agree. But if I look at the Hungarian government example, what they had was people said you couldn't graph out the economy. And what they did is they took transaction level VAT data and used that to graph out the entire economy. We're doing making tax digital in the UK. I don't think we're recording transaction level VAT information. It would be fabulous if we were. But that understanding of a supply chain and the impacts of that, how's that going to be done other than through a government body? Because I mean, I can't see how it can be done.
It's a very good question, and I think policy obviously has to play an absolutely crucial role in all of this. And I can't speak on behalf of the government, but I am tangentially linked to it, I suppose, in some ways by being funded by the UK government. The UK government has a role to play in leadership. Absolutely. It needs to set the direction. It needs to be able to define how things might move towards public interest or public value. And supply chains are very much about public interest, public value. It doesn't matter which angle you take it from, either be it the economy or be it society or the environment. It's the public value. So the leadership from the UK government is really important. There has been some mobilization towards that. So there's been some work over the last few years, particularly focused around digital twins, which have been all around how we can create a digital replica of the supply chain. And as part of that, the risk is that lots of different companies build lots of digital twin platforms, and then we are in exactly the same situation as we have been for the last 30 years, and none of them work together. They're all made up of lots of different technology providers who may be help to build that, but underpinned by a system integrator who ultimately we're all reliant on. So how do we move beyond that? There has been a growing movement around something called cyber-physical infrastructure, which is quite possibly one of the worst named things that's ever been designed. But what it is around how digital and the physical world come together, and the tools and platforms and capabilities and protocols and standards that would enable that to happen. And what we're trying to look at is how we build ecosystems around specific missions that are related to that. So the UK government did a consultation last year around cyber-physical infrastructure. It's being led, though, however, mostly by industry, and it's a little bit like one of those, house of cards or a house of matchsticks that's kind of glued together, and everyone's holding each side of it. Yep. So at the moment, it takes all parties, but what we want to get to is a less reliance on big tech players, a more sustainable ecosystem for digital technology providers, and better national resilience, but not at the expense of a global technology market. So all of those things need to come together, and that's why supply chains are absolutely vital to that, because they go cross borders and they require data flows between so many different parties. So government leadership, absolutely essential. They're starting it, but it's taking still a bit of pushing, to be honest.
So Amanda, how does open source software fit into all this? Risks, what are some of the mitigations? What are people doing about it? Yeah.
I think the contextualization, particularly for this room, of what's happening in the supply chain is really important. So first of all, understanding that big picture that Simon's talking about, and then understanding the work that UK government is already leading on, because we'll have most impact as an open source community if we can liaise with, engage with, and be part of that, rather than being off at left field. So I think that's very important. We have not seen the same level in the UK as we've seen in the US, and most recently in the EU, of legislation-driven approaches. So the Biden ordinance back in May 2021, you'll see in our legal group, which Chris over there runs, they responded to that in May 2021. And it was the first piece of legislation that I had ever seen that talks about open source in an appropriate way. And there was a chap who was CTO in the White House who's a long-term open source contributor, David Gordon, who left, I think, 2 weeks ago. And I think he and others were working very hard to make legislation that had language that actually worked for open source. And it is not a cure-all by any manner of means, but having supply chain as a start point, starting to work out SBOMs and create standards around them, software bill of materials, starting to know what software you're using is a good step forward. Now, you're never going to be able to fix this, because there are going to be dependencies down the line that you're never going to be able to identify. So it's not, a magic wand fix to everything, but it is a major step forward to have SBOMs and to have supply chain structured and understood. And I think it's a very important one that we should collaborate with international. I was about to say we should collaborate with international players in this, but that's what we do. So the point of OpenUK is to bring all of you together in a space, because our day jobs are international collaboration. So those of us who work in things like Open Chain and who are working on SPDX and other supply chain initiatives already collaborate globally. And that's what we can bring into the UK, is that we are part of this global collaboration. What we need to bring in also is this interaction with what's already happening on supply chains more generally. And when we think about open source, I want to pick up on something Jim Zemlin said. He said that security is not specifically an open source problem. Security is a software problem, it's a digital problem. If you're going to use digital technology, as we have established we are all doing, you are going to be software defined, you are going to have vulnerabilities, there is no escaping it. Now, I could advocate for open source first, but I'm not going to. What I'm going to say is whichever you are using, you need to understand both your supply chain and how you manage vulnerabilities and what the response to those will be. Now, from an open source perspective, I'm using this phrase more and more, but we wash our dirty linen in public, right? When something goes wrong, everybody knows about it. Last year, after the Biden ordinance, Shell4j, vulnerability on the Log4j software package, which Mark will talk to you about in the security session this afternoon, Shell4j affected 3 billion platforms. I mean, it's huge, it's unthinkable, the scale of it. But also the scale of the response and the transparency around the response and the transparency in how that was dealt with was phenomenal. And one of the things that I was told is that companies who didn't know they were using it because they didn't know they were using open source, they thought they had proprietary code, were actually the slowest to be able to fix it. And that comes back to the perversity of this supply chain issue. It matters equally, I think, in proprietary as it does in open source, because I don't think people fully understand what they're using, whichever they're using. Kate Stewart should have been on this panel, but had COVID and wasn't able to travel. And Kate's an SPDX person, and she did a presentation for us as part of the Summer of Open Source Software Security, which is available online. And in it, she talks about how more than 70% of companies in the US are now apparently using SBOMs. So we asked that question in our OpenUK survey, and it was just over 20%. Huge difference. This piece of legislation requiring federal organizations to have those SBOMs in place, the obligation being on the user, not the open source community. So those users have to get this. And if the user needs to get something, the user needs to pay for it. So building that out is a huge part of what the US government has been doing through this legislation. And I think 3 weeks ago now, we saw the Cyber Act come out of the EU. It does a weird thing that I'm not happy with. And at Recital 10, it talks about commercial open source software. There is no such thing. All software that's open source can be used commercially. All open source software potentially has contributors who are commercial. So I actually was lucky enough to meet the lady behind it, Lorena Bois-something, one of the directors at the Commission, and she told me that wasn't their intention. She also told me that they'd intentionally lifted what they could from the Biden ordinance because they agree it is so good, and that's the EU's plan. The EU is going to be focusing on the user responsibility. And that user responsibility isn't just for software. It's much, much broader than that. So security. The user responsibility isn't just for security, it's much broader than that. There's a whole package of things that are necessary for good curation of open source software. And this is what we were talking about in the prep call, right? But all the queries you're now getting.
Yep.
Okay, so we've got time for questions. I'm going to ask you to briefly, 1 minute each, maximum. What would you do to one practical step to improve things? Matt, we'll start with you. I got all right.
I wouldn't say that I have one practical step. I think you have to think about it in the context of looking at the whole situation with supply chain. I think I would definitely start with education being number one, to Jim's point earlier, but is that all I'm allowed to say?
You can say that if that's where you think you should start.
Okay, I'm going to start with education then. Yeah, we need to learn about what code we've got, how we've got it, how it got there, how we update it, how we secure it, what it is. Yeah, that's what we need to look at. We need to get visibility and understanding of what we've got right now.
Okay. Simon.
Nettisham wrote a paper on topographical intelligence and the American Civil War. And basically what helped the North win was they created mapping corps, topographical institutes. So the one thing I would have right now is a department of the supply chain within UK government.
That's a very good idea. So I think supply chains fall through the gaps by being the gaps between things, which is quite ironic, and I think it's one of the most important things that make things work. So I completely agree with some sort of government leadership around this, but just generally leadership. I think open source leadership should come together with the emerging innovation landscape. A lot of this is semantics, right? I mean, I operate in the world of hype and hyperbole, to be honest. You already mentioned metaverse, digital twins. You know, that's my life, and I regularly having to cut through all of that. But actually, most of the problems or challenges that we're talking about here are just semantics. They're all about the same issues that we're facing across all these different areas as we move towards, for example, an open and interoperable metaverse for the future. You know, the whole debate around meta dominance or other platforms dominating the landscape as this new emerging internet comes through. So open source is an underpinning capability for this that helps us to break free of dominance of big tech or of reliance on any particular actor. It's a community ecosystem engagement tool. And for me, a better understanding around it is absolutely vital to making this all work. When I've spoken to policymakers in the past within government, open source to them means free. And they don't understand the commercial value or how you would commercialize open source. And so their first thought is, well, that would be detrimental to the economy rather than thinking that it would be valuable. And it's those disconnects in the reality of how software is built. So understanding that, not just at the government level, I'm pointing finger at the government, but that happens in all aspects of all businesses as well at the leadership level. Yeah. So leadership is vital to making this work, and that means a collective leadership from all different parties and from the open source community.
Thank you.
I'm going to go a bit left field, and I'm going to say that the one thing I would change is I would encourage a risk-based approach, and I would encourage a better understanding of where the risk lies. So when I opened this up this morning, I talked about the shift from contracts to policies and procedures. And when we're talking about open source supply chain, we're talking about that because we're worried about risk, we're worried about the end user not implementing well. So understanding what the risk is and where it lies would make a completely different landscape for us to look at, I think.
Yeah.
You're never going to stop her being a lawyer, are you?
Can we rip off these? Because
I'd like to respond.
Okay.
I mean, we have a terminology when we're dealing with customers. If anyone's taken out a mortgage, there's like that know your customer checklist where the bank's trying to work out what risk profile you are based on fraud. We think about the same thing inside our organization of, you know your dependencies, know your code, and we kind of, there's lots of these frameworks and tools now you can actually start to look at and create a risk profile of the code that you're actually bringing inside the organization. 20% of it you might realize based on your particular risk appetite. You're not going to use a tool, you're not going to bring it in. 20% might be, yeah, that's absolutely fine because it's from a trusted source, I know it, I understand it, it's fine. There's that middle ground where you have to start to understand and make a decision based on your risk profile as to whether you're going to bring it in.
And that's where the policy, you might not be able to take the lawyer out of the girl, but instead of focusing on contracts, focus on procedures. Focus on procedures that engineers can actually utilize sitting under these general policies, procedures that they'll comply with so that you manage your code in an appropriate way.
So this is fantastic, but I'm going to disagree.
Good.
Oh, yeah, excellent. So
that means you're wrong, Simon.
Actually, focus on principles, not necessarily processes. And the reason why I'm going to say that is when you start looking at the context, the landscape of something. Things like rivalrousness, excludability, substitutability matter, but also how evolved the components are. And so components start off, practices, data, knowledge, ethical values all evolve, and they go through common sort of stages: the genesis of the novel new, custom built examples, products and rental services, commodity and utility services. And the practices that you apply to those depend upon how evolved it is. So something, we often talk about agile extreme programming, very good for Genesis custom built, terrible for building utilities. Things like Six Sigma, brilliant for building utilities, not very good for the Genesis and the custom built. In the middle, more sort of Scrum plus MVP. So whenever you look at a complicated system, you need to apply multiple different methods. And that's a principle. Use appropriate methods. So it's the same with contract structures as well, because when you take a complicated system, break it down into contracts, you do need to break it down into contracts, and the methods that you use, purchasing methods, finance methods, need to be cognizant of how evolved the component is. Now, to connect to the open source is a very powerful weapon for manipulating that landscape if you can see it. And that's one of the things that we did do.
But Simon,
at Canonical.
I do want to respond to that.
Yeah.
So I don't agree with you, and I don't agree with you on the basis that, and I don't know about the theory, and I need to think about all the stuff you've just said, which I will do.
Yeah.
But at a practical level, what we've seen is strategy based on principles. And the principles are that we have an open source first strategy, therefore what we have to do is put code on a public repository and put an open source approved license on it, a standard license from the OSI. So there you have the UK's principles, their strategy around open source. And the driver behind it is economics. So the driver is to avoid vendor lock-in. The driver is to make code that is recycled and reused, which over time will save money. However, it doesn't work because these principles at that level only allow you to do something that can be messed around with. Without the detail and the underlying engineering procedures behind it, the principles alone are not enough. And you end up with situations, I've done work over the course of this year with the public sector, and you end up with situations where effectively you develop code in a closed environment, you throw it over the wall because you make it public at the end, you stick an OSI approved license on it, then you carry on as if you're a proprietary company, because you are a proprietary company, and you carry on making proprietary code, but you call it open source, and you get funding from government to do that, and it's just not open source. And the reason it's not open source is that you're not bringing the value that open source brings. So open source brings contribution, it brings collaboration, it brings documentation, it builds well-made code that's well-maintained, it builds secure code by all of those things. Matt's problem with the code not being updated, that's a policy issue at the end side and the end user. So I don't think I agree with you.
So I love this, and the reason why I love this, because I deal with all these different companies. The principle is things like focusing on user need, okay? Understanding the components involved. Open source by thinking is a principle. Beliefs are things like I believe in, honesty, or I believe in open source by default. So what I often see is people, when they say principles, most of the time what they've actually listed down are not principles, are actually beliefs. And this sort of like beliefs, they're great things to have, purpose, moral imperative and all that sort of stuff, but, and there are a limited subset of principles in terms of which are universally useful. Things like, for example, use appropriate methods, open by thinking, focus on user needs. So I think there might be that's the cause of our disagreement, is how people are using the word principle, rather than, because I think a lot of people mix beliefs with principles.
Okay. Much as I know the debate could carry on, and I'd realised this from our prep board, I'd like to give 2 minutes, 40 seconds left. Questions? Anybody got a question?
So Kate is not here, but she asked me to come, so I work on SBDX, one of the core contributors. So my question is, like, I get a lot of pressure now from government to say, hey, can we make SBDX or CycleDX or any of the other sort mandatory more than now? So what is the opinion of making SBOMs mandatory?
I think it would be a good idea. Yeah.
In the US. US, right?
Yeah,
it's
I mean,
already mandatory for federal use in the US.
I think to me, although it's one part of the story, it's great that we've got the best minds talking about it, thinking about it, adopting it, using it, and it wouldn't be a bad thing, I think, if we decided to do that. So that's my opinion on it. Anyone else?
It's a starting point.
Yes, a starting point. Yeah.
As long as people don't go, oh, we make it mandatory, job done.
Yes, exactly.
Right. That's exactly what I see now. So SBOMs in reality are very much still in their immature phase.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing government that's like, oh, we're going to make it mandatory, I want you to do it. I literally have the DoD giving me a document with 1,700 fields that please, I run the security profile, 1,700 fields, can you please add this to SPDX security profile? And I was like, so.
It's part of why it has to work for the engineers, right? So it's all very well having these highfalutin principles and saying we're going to create these laws, but we have to know that it's actually going to be possible to deliver those. And this is again what we were talking about with how do you suddenly get all these requests and manage them?
Really difficult. Just to add, I would say that innovation, I mean, being an innovation centre, is a good enabler for a pathway towards things becoming more mandatory. I think it needs to be tested and trialled in and alongside lots of other aspects of this. So SBOMs and SPDX, I'm sure, will add a lot of value, but of course it depends on the context and how it's utilised, and then you need to prove the value. That's often the reticence to this, to these types of things being adopted. So I think if there was maybe an obligation or a requirement for them to be used in a subset of projects, for example, that are related to innovation and R&D in the UK, you could use that as a pathway to trying to secure greater support from the landscape.
And working with GDS and Mike early in the sort of the genesis of that organisation, the exemplar projects were a good example of taking a set of open source technologies that work really well for gov.uk and then replicating them in various departments and agencies, and it worked really well. Then, can we do it again? That's the question.
Exactly.
I don't know.
And we're out.
I'm afraid, because I can see hands popping, lots of hands popping up, lots of ideas. We have timed out. This feels like a discussion to happen over lunch, but we have one more panel to come in first. Thank you, all of you.